that for each of us there is a steady increase in suffering, in burdens, in weights upon the mind that follows from the material progress which is taking place in the world. This is an important point to examine from the start. We ought to observe the fact that from the very beginning of human history, when the human species started to settle into very primitive communities, and then through the successive stages of progress, of development, that as this step-by-step development has taken place along with the evolution of the human species, that with each stage there has also been an increase in problems related to the business of living. This has gone on steadily throughout the course of human history. Problems increasing along with the evolution of the species, especially the problem that we call dukkha, mental pain, mental suffering, anguish, which comes from selfishness. This is a fact which it is very important for us to observe. When we observe, we may notice that physical problems, the problems related to the body and our environment and surroundings, that many of these have lessened with the development and progress in the world. On the other hand, the inner problems of the mental problems have been increasing steadily. These two developments are going in opposite directions. On the one hand, physical progress leads to less physical problems, but at the same time there is a steady increase in mental, spiritual problems. And when you notice this, you ought to look and see which kind of problem, the physical problems or the mental problems, which of these problems torments the mind most of all. All of our mental problems arise from the same cause. This cause is that all this material progress leads to more and more selfishness. Our increasing mental problems arise out of the selfishness which comes with the steady increase in material comforts. This is the essence of the matter, the problem of selfishness. This is something that we need to take very special interest in. The common understanding that is taught in our schools now only sees half of the problem. We all learn about the problems that arise, the social problems that arise from selfishness, that how human selfishness creates problems for other people and for society. But that's only half of the matter. The fact of it is that selfishness also creates far more problems for the individual who is selfish. Selfishness doesn't only have external effects, it has very powerful effects internally. Whenever there is selfishness, it is impossible to relax and rest and take it easy. So please don't just focus on the social ills, the punishment and penalty that arises to the society, such as crime, which comes from selfishness. At the same time, or even more important, we need to observe the inner penalty, the punishment, the danger of selfishness within our own mind, even when we're by ourselves, where we can do no damage to someone else. If we're alone with our own selfishness, then we just roast and torment ourselves with that selfishness. It burns us up, even when we're by ourselves. We need to realize this suffering, the internal mental suffering that arises from selfishness. All the different kinds of defilement, of kilesa, mental defilement, arises from selfishness. Through all the course of human history, all the various levels and degrees and developments of defilement have arisen out of selfishness, from selfishness. This word defilement is something that is very seldom talked about, and we often don't have a very clear understanding of it. So please, let's take a good look at what is meant by defilement. You may have an understanding of what the word defilement is, this English translation of the Pali word kilesa. But we'd like to talk about the different kinds of defilement so that you see really clearly what these things we're talking about, these sources of so many problems for us all. The English word defilement doesn't really come very close to encompassing all the meaning of the Pali word, the word kilesa. So let's talk about the three basic types or directions in which kilesa runs. The first kind of kilesa is the type of greed and lust. It has the basic condition of pulling things towards it, of trying to gather and acquire. This is the first type of kilesa. The second type of kilesa is the opposite. It's dissatisfaction, not liking, hating, wanting to destroy, wanting to kill. It has the basic condition of pushing away, of wanting to destroy or even kill something in order to get rid of it. And the third type of defilement is that of not knowing, of foolishness, ignorance, stupidity, delusion, confusion, doubt, worry, and all kinds of endless wishes and dreams and hopes. This is the third sort of kilesa. It has the basic condition of running in circles around the thing, running in circles around the doubt, around the unknowing, the confusion. These are the three basic kinds of kilesa, and the meaning of kilesa then is much broader than the English word defilement. For those of you who are Christian, if you take the word Satan and take your understanding of the meaning of the word Satan and then double or triple or quadruple the meaning of Satan, if you do this, then you're beginning to understand what is meant by kilesa. If you understand, to the degree you understand the word Satan, and then double and triple that, to that degree you will begin to see how ugly and fearful the kilesa, the defilements are. And when you begin to see them as they are like this, and see how ugly and frightening and disgusting, then you'll be interested in learning how to get rid of them, in how to destroy them, by eliminating their cause, by stopping selfishness, which will eliminate these ugly and foul kilesa. There's a secret of life which is of great importance to us. In life, there is a natural instinct, which we would call the instinct of self. There is a fundamental instinct of self, which begins with life. This is the instinct from which arises the need to protect life in order for life to survive. This is a basic neutral instinct. But once the being is born into the world, then it comes across all kinds of delicious, satisfying, attractive experiences. Various stimuli attract it and encourage it. And as the being comes into contact with these things, the instinct of self begins to develop in a harmful way. These various delicious experiences lead to the self-instinct degenerating into the defilement or degenerating into selfishness. And then selfishness causes all the various kinds of kilesa or defilement. This is because the neutral self-instinct gets out of control. It indulges in all these delicious experiences that happen to even the newborn human infant. But that's just half of the story. We also need to be aware that this self-instinct can also be developed in a different direction, the direction of poti, or enlightenment. The basic instinct of self that is necessary for the creature, for the organism to survive, this need not become a basis for selfishness. There's this instinct of thinking that there is a self, of believing in some I or self. But that need not develop into selfishness. Instead, that can be, though that fundamental sense of self may be there, it can be developed towards enlightenment rather than selfishness. So there is this, and this is why we take an interest in Dhamma, in studying Buddhism, in doing introspection, in learning about how the mind works, and then training the mind. Because defilement, kilesa, is not the only possibility. We ought to be very clear. We ought to make it absolutely certain to ourselves and obvious that there is this other possibility of enlightenment, of developing life in the direction of awakening. But often we're so caught up in our sense of self that it's leading to all kinds of forms of selfishness and kilesa. And we're not. And when our mind is dominated by selfishness and kilesa, it's very difficult to be aware of the potential for awakening, for bodhi. So please look at this and see the entire picture, understand this very important secret of life, and then you will be able to start doing the work of developing life in the direction of bodhi, of awakening. By now it should be obvious that in order to control the defilements, the kilesa, we must be able to control selfishness, to keep it from getting out of hand. And in order to control selfishness, we will have to be able to control the instincts. It works successively like this. So we will learn about controlling the instincts in order to control selfishness, in order to control the defilements. And so in order to do this, we will look into the instincts in a bit of detail. The things we call the instincts are just natural kinds of knowledge. They are fundamental to life, and they're also neutral. They're neither defiled nor enlightened. They're neutral. But they are also very strong. They have a great influence over life. And out of these instincts, there are all these fundamental drives of searching for food, of fleeing for danger, of reproduction, and so forth. These are very powerful and direct the life of the animal or human being or any living thing in the directions according to the instincts. But these are neutral. They're neither defiled nor enlightened. The infant in the mother's womb has no thoughts about itself, and the instincts have not yet begun to function. These are unnecessary while the fetus is still in the womb. But after birth, the infant begins to experience food. It has toys to play with. People cuddle it and do what they can to take care of it. And so in various ways, the young child, the baby, begins to feel good. It has nice things. It has nice feelings. And when it begins to experience these comforts and delights, it starts to enjoy them, to be satisfied with them. And then when this happens, there begins to be desire for these nice things, for these pleasant feelings and sensations, for feeling good. After this desire arises, if it becomes more solidified and if it becomes more stupid or foolish, then there begins to arise a sense of I, the desirer. First there's just desire for these nice, pleasant things. But then if this desire gets foolish, there's a sense of I, the desirer. And this leads to the problems of selfishness. It works like this for all of us. First there is just desire, but then desire develops into the desirer, the craver, the one who is thirsty and hungry. But it all began with those basic instincts. But if they get out of control, it leads to selfishness. The things around us in life lead to selfishness. At first, there is only this sense of self, but then this develops into selfishness. For example, in Thailand, when somebody is raising a young child, if anything comes along to bother the child or cause it pain, then the older brother or sister or whoever's looking after the infant will hit away that thing, whether it's an animal or another person or whatever, to protect the child. And when this happens, it gives the infant more and more a sense of self and of selfishness. And other things, some things that delight the infant, these start to have more weight for it. And in this way, this sense of self slowly grows into selfishness. So that even sometimes a child, something doesn't come along and bother the child, but maybe the child is careless and bumps into a chair. And then the child will turn around and kick the chair because it perceives its sense of self has developed into selfishness, and it blames the chair instead of his or her own carelessness. So in this way, the objects and things around us stir up selfishness, and the sense of self gets out of hand. So when the instinctual sense of self gets stirred up into selfishness, then we start to react in different ways. There are things that we like. And then we start to feel desires for them and start to try and acquire and get these things that please us, that satisfy us, that make us happy. And then when we get selfish about this, about getting the things that make us happy, then we start to take advantage of others, we compete with others, we take things away from others, we even exploit and harm others because of this selfishness. And we go so far with this selfishness, with this acquiring and exploiting, that we get to where we want to own the entire world. We want to own and control everything so that we can manipulate them to satisfy our wants and desires. And think about it. What happens when the world is full of people who are thinking like this? When the world is made up of nothing but people who are trying to get the things that make them happy and are willing to step on others and take advantage of others, and even trying to control the world in the name of their nation or group or whatever. Trying to own the world, to be God, in order to get what they want. Think about it when the world is made up of nothing but people like this. People who are acting selfishly. A world full of kilesa, full of defilement. If we can begin to see that this is the situation that we find ourselves in, and we realize that we are a member of this world, that we are one of the lives inhabiting this world of selfishness and kilesa, then we might start to take an interest in a different way of living, a way of living that is no longer based in selfishness and kilesa. A life that is free of these kilesa of greed, anger, fear, hatred, confusion, and so forth. Remember, we mentioned there are three basic directions in which the kilesa flow. There is the direction of greed in lust, of wanting, desiring, trying to get the things that we like and that make us happy. And then there is the anger and hatred that arises when we don't get our way, when we don't get what we want. Both of these very obviously are coming from selfishness, a positive kind of selfishness and a negative kind of selfishness. And then last is the type of defilement which is delusion. This is when we don't know what should be done, and so we act merely out of selfishness. Instead of doing what ought to be done, we do what is selfish. And so these are the three kinds of kilesa that make up the common way of life in this world. It's not very difficult to see if we look around or look inside. We'll see this common kind of life, the life that is under the power of selfishness. Why not be interested in a new kind of life? A new life that is free of all this selfishness, all this greed, hatred, and confusion. Take a look, and you'll probably see that you are a member of the association of selfishness. You're a member of a selfish world. You're a member of the club of selfishness. We can see that sometimes we're selfish even towards our own mother and father. We act selfishly towards them. Or we can be selfish towards our own husband or wife. And sometimes even towards our children. Towards our little children, we do selfish things. And this is just within our families. What about the selfishness towards our friends, our neighbors? Or sometimes we're selfish towards the entire world. This is what it means to be a member of the association of selfishness, or a member of this selfish world. This is something that we should not overlook or try to pretend that it does not exist. If we look, children argue with each other because of selfishness. Or teenagers, even boyfriends and girlfriends, argue and get into quarrels because of selfishness. Husbands and wives argue out of selfishness. We argue with our neighbors and friends because of selfishness. There are conflicts between us and them only because of selfishness. Or the government argues and gets into all kinds of conflicts with the opposition, the political opposition, merely because of selfishness. Or there are problems and conflicts between the government and the people because of selfishness. Not to mention the conflicts and strife and wars that arise between governments and between nations. All the different kinds of conflict, strife, aggression, war, and quarrels are coming out of selfishness. This is the world of this is the problems that the world is falling into, the problems of selfishness. This problem of selfishness, we can see it in the current state of political affairs of this world of ours that is divided into two halves. And both of these halves are selfish. The communists are selfish in their way, and the capitalists are selfish in their way. Each of them is selfish according to their own opinions and theories and ideas. And because of this selfishness, they're piling up weapons in order to get what they want, in order to destroy the other side. So the selfishness exists even on a world scale like this, where the world is divided up into us and them, and there's all this competition and aggression, all arising out of selfishness. And this goes so far that now that there have been developed all these weapons of mass destruction, all these nuclear weapons of which we are all afraid, and there are so many of them now that the world can be destroyed not just once, but many times over. They have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world, we don't know how many times. And so the world is heading for destruction because of selfishness. It starts with just a small, tiny grain or particle of selfishness, and then it's grown to the degree that now the world is being destroyed. The entire world is going to ruin. It's on the verge of destruction because of selfishness. This is how it is when we look on it on the worldly scale. It's very obviously what the danger of selfishness is. But we also come and can look inside ourselves and see what selfishness does to each of us. How it destroys our ability to be at peace. How selfishness piles up endless burdens upon life and turns life into an endless string of suffering. So just a little bit of selfishness gets out of control and grows, and it's destroying the world, and it's destroying our own lives as well. If you're afraid of Satan, or if you hate Satan, then hate the real Satan, don't mistake what Satan or the devil is. Or if you're afraid or disgusted with Hitler or whatever kind of thing for you is the personification of evil, then see where the real source of evil is. Find the thing that it is that you really hate, that you really ought to be disgusted with. Satan is really nothing but selfishness. It's just a personification of selfishness. And this is where we ought to aim our disgust, at this selfishness. And then we see that the only thing there is to do is to get rid of selfishness. This is the most important thing in our lives, is to get rid of selfishness. This is the matter that we come here to study. We may talk about it in many different ways. in order to bring the point home, but it all boils down to this very simple fact. Our problem is selfishness. And so we study this point until we understand it. And then we practice. We do whatever is necessary in order to free life of selfishness. We find out how, and then we do it. We found out what needs to be done to get rid of selfishness. And so we come here to Suan Mok in order to learn these things. And this is why we practice mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati bhavana. We do mindfulness of breathing because it is a very efficient and powerful way to get rid of selfishness. And so this is what we're here for. This is the point in joining this course. It all comes down to just understanding selfishness and then working, practicing in order to get rid of it. This is the only thing that matters. Mindfulness of breathing is a system of study in practice in which we come to fully, in a very deep and profound way, understand what selfishness is, what the cause of selfishness is, find out what it is to get rid of selfishness, and to learn and understand how to get rid of selfishness. This is what mindfulness of breathing is about, to understand selfishness in this complete way. In doing so, we study the body, come to understand the body well enough, and then the feelings which have very great influence over life, and the mind. We study this and learn to use it. And finally, we study everything, the truth, the fundamental truths of all existence, to see that there is nothing that is really self. There is nothing that is truly I or mine. And when the mind begins to understand this truth, then it lets go of things. It destroys all selfishness. There is no more selfishness, and then the mind realizes that it is free, that there is no more selfishness, and the mind is free. This is what mindfulness of breathing is about. This is the goal of mindfulness of breathing. It's a very systematic, organized practice in order to realize the end of selfishness, the liberation of life. So we have a second thing to talk about, but this second thing is really the first thing to talk about. We have sort of two first things to talk about. The second thing isn't of any less importance than the first thing, and it goes along with it. So it's really the second first thing to talk about. And what this second first thing is about the mode of living, the way of living, the style of living that is necessary in order to practice mindfulness of breathing. That practice can't be separated from the mode of living which supports that and nurtures it. And so this will be the second first thing to talk about today. In the Pali language, we call this second matter the pacaya, or in Thai, the pachai, which is usually translated into English as conditions. But once again, the English translation isn't quite sufficient. So listen carefully to the pacaya that we will discuss, and then you'll know the meaning of this. The pacaya are the conditions of life, the conditions for life. They're the things which support life, the necessities of life. And it's not just enough to have these conditions. They must be correct. If these conditions are not correct, then it will not be possible to practice meditation correctly and properly in order to realize the highest benefits. So we need to be particularly interested in these conditions, or pacaya. When we talk about the Bhajaya, most people just think about the material conditions, the material necessities of life: clothing, food, shelter, and medicine. Most people only think on the material level, which is really quite foolish and not so very wise or intelligent. There's more to life than just the body and just these 4 physical material necessities of life. There's also a 5th condition or Bhajaya, which is, we could say, things which cajole and soothe and pacify the mind. We might call this mental entertainment, but it's got to be the correct sort of entertainment. If it's wrong entertainment, then it will kill the mind. Without the 4 physical material necessities, the physical part of life cannot continue. And the mental, spiritual side of life has its necessity as well. And this is something we might call spiritual entertainment, a correct kind of thing which will perk up and soothe and inspire the mind. So there are 5 kinds of conditions or necessities of life, not just the 4 physical ones. This is a point we must make clear. There are not just physical material necessities to life. There is a 5th, which is mental. The first condition or necessity is food. Food which we eat in order to maintain the body for life to continue. It's one necessity. But please be careful that food doesn't become bait. Don't eat in a way that turns food into bait, like the kind of bait that is put on a fish hook in order to catch a fish. If we eat what is in a healthy, wise way in order to maintain life, so that life can go on, then food is used as food. But if we eat for deliciousness, to indulge in tastes and flavors and sensations, if we eat for entertainment, if we turn food into a toy or a plaything, then it becomes bait, and then it turns ourselves into fish dangling on the end of hooks. So first of all, please use food as food. Eat enough to remain healthy, and then leave it at that. Don't turn the food into bait. This is the first condition. Please be very careful about this, especially for the time that you are here at Suan Mok. If we eat food, or if we turn food into bait, then we'll be hungry and thirsty all the time. If we turn food into bait, we won't be able to stop thinking about it. When food is just food, we eat enough. We set aside certain times for eating, and then we eat a sufficient amount of food, and that's all there is to it. And we don't have to be roasting in hunger all day long. But when we turn food into playthings, and when we just try and have fun and indulge with it, when food becomes bait, then we always have to be sneaking off to have a snack to get some more food. And when this is the case, the mind loses its ability to be calm and cool. It's almost impossible to do any decent meditation. And so it becomes quite a struggle to study and practice Dhamma. So please be very careful about this. Use food as food, because if it becomes bait, it will very strongly interfere with your ability to practice meditation. The second necessity is clothing. And so please use clothing, use this necessity of life in a way that is appropriate for the goal or purpose of clothing. We use clothing in order for the comfort and health of the body, to protect the body from various things which can interfere with health. And so we use clothing that is healthy and that is proper protection that is adequately comfortable. Clothing is also an expression or manifestation of culture. Not just the larger culture, but our own individual personal culture as well. So our use of clothing ought to reflect a high level of culture instead of a low level of culture, and at the same time that it serves the purpose of protecting the body, in keeping the body healthy. So please give some thought and attention to the proper use of this second necessity of life, clothing. The third necessity is shelter, is a place to live. This is something to give some thought to also. To have a kind of shelter, to have shelter which is adequate for our needs, but does not go much further than that. Now it's popular in the West to build very big, expensive and fancy housing. This is also becoming popular in the East as well. And we air condition our places, and we stack many houses on top of each other, and we get apartment buildings. And so that many Westerners, when they come to Asia, they're not able to stay in a simple place like a monastery. They have to stay in big, fancy, concrete, air-conditioned hotels. The effect of this is that it separates people from nature. And so a proper kind of shelter is a kind of shelter that is simple and brings us close to nature. So the most useful kind of shelter is a kind in which we are intimate with nature. Because when we are living close to nature, intimately with nature, then it is easy to study nature and understand nature and learn how to live in a very natural way. So this is the third necessity of life. We should be very interested in finding a kind of shelter that is intimate with nature in order that we can live with nature instead of against it. We Buddhists like to use the Buddha as an example and standard. The Buddha was born out in the open, was born on the ground. The Buddha was enlightened while sitting on the ground. The Buddha taught others while sitting under trees on the ground. And in the end, the Buddha died on the ground. He didn't die in any expensive hospital or palace or anything like that. The Buddha spent his entire life close to nature. And we like to use this as an example and inspiration for us, that this individual who came to understand nature as deeply as possible also was very close and intimate with nature. The same is true, we think, of all the great prophets, that they lived in very simple ways and spent their lives very close to nature. And so we ask you all to follow this example, to live close to nature, to live simply. Because when we're close to nature, then it's much easier to hear what nature has to teach us. When we're close to nature, it's much easier to listen, to hear, and to learn. But if we live very far away from nature, it's impossible to hear the message. So let's find a way of living that is very simple, that is intimate with nature. The fourth necessity of life is medicine, which won't need much explanation, but to have adequate medicine to take care of the body's needs, to keep the body healthy in a correct way. These are the four material necessities of life: food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. The essence, or the most important thing to remember about these four necessities is that they need to be adequate and sufficient. In Thai, there is the word padi, which means enough, sufficient, adequate. There's also the word di, which means good or well. And so some people like to talk about eating well and living well. And we point out that that's very dangerous because it leads to all kinds of excesses and turns into selfishness. Instead of eating well and living well, we recommend eating sufficiently, living sufficiently, eating what is enough and living in an adequate, sufficient way. This is safe and is correct. So the important thing about all four of these material conditions or requisites is that they be correct, that they neither be too little so that life is endangered, or that they are so much that they lead to all kinds of selfishness and become burdens. So be very careful that these four necessities are taken care of in a way that is sufficient, that is adequate. Eating enough, living well enough. Eating well enough, living well enough, but not too much. These are the four material necessities. The fifth necessity of life we can call entertainment. Usually nobody talks about this. We only hear people talking about the four material necessities. But really it's obvious that we all need a fifth. There's also a fifth mental necessity. We all need something to entertain, to please, to satisfy the mind, to cajole or coddle or coax or whatever is necessary to make the mind happy and pleased and satisfied. This is something that we're all searching for all the time. And so it's a very important necessity. It's more important, actually, than the physical necessities. Without this one, we would all die mentally, or we would be spiritually dead. The Thai word is bralau bralomjai, which is, I have a lot of trouble translating into English. For now, we'll use the word entertainment. The mind needs entertainment. But we have to be very careful with this, because nowadays in the world, we can say that almost the entire world is interested in only one kind of entertainment, and this is sex. The only kind of entertainment people want nowadays is sex. It may either be sex directly, or it may be various kinds of sensual indulgences which have sex as their aim or are somehow caught up with sex. But the entertainment which dominates the world is now very closely or very much caught up in sex. This kind of entertainment isn't the kind we're talking about. The mental entertainment, which is the fifth necessity that we're discussing, is Dhamma. To use Dhamma to entertain the mind. When we say Dhamma to entertain the mind, it is just to be correct and know that life is correct, that life is going along correctly, rightly, that there's nothing wrong with life. And when there is Dhamma in life, when there is this correctness, then the mind can be satisfied in the right way, in a very calm and cool way. But just the awareness of this correctness of Dhamma gives the mind a very, very strong sense of satisfaction, and the mind is joyful. This is the kind of entertainment that we encourage you to be interested in, to study Dhamma and practice Dhamma, so that there is correctness in life. And then to be satisfied, be pleased with this correctness, and that will bring a very strong and calm joy, which is what most of us are looking for anyway. The building over here that you passed on the way here is called the Theater of Spiritual Entertainment. It's not a theater that shows dirty movies or anything like that. There's nothing in there but pictures about Dhamma. People can look at the pictures and get some enjoyment in thinking about and learning about Dhamma. This is a clean kind of entertainment, and it brings joy to the mind just the same. Entertainment, the mental entertainment of the mind, which is correctness or Dhamma. So these are five conditions of life which we need to take care of in order for life to continue. Please, while you're staying here, adjust these 5 conditions of life so that they are suitable, that these 5 needs are met in a way that is suitable for the practice of Dhamma. If this is done, then these 5 supports will nurture the study and practice of Dhamma and meditation. If they are taken care of correctly and sufficiently, then they will aid the practice that we are doing here. So please adjust your mode of living to be appropriate to the correct satisfaction of these 5 necessities of life. When this is done correctly, then it becomes possible to study the mind and to practice Dhamma so that the mind can be freed from the influence of positivism and negativism, from all the positive and negative things which have so much power and influence over the mind. With the 5 necessities taken care of, then we can move on to doing this work of freeing the mind from the influence of positives and negatives. This is what we'll be talking about later, but for now we'll end the lecture at this point. In the previous talk, we discussed selfishness. That is, we talked about the old life, the old way of life of selfishness, which is dukkha, or suffering. And we also talked about the new life that is free of selfishness, that isn't dukkha, that isn't suffering. Today, we will discuss the cause of selfishness, or the basis, the foundation of selfishness, which we call the 5 khanda, the 5 aggregates. We talked about selfishness as the cause of all kilesa, defilement, of these low and evil satans, which are the base of our problems in life, which bring suffering, pain, dukkha into our lives. Now we need to look at how to get rid of, how to destroy selfishness in order to free life from these problems. And so we'll look into how to destroy selfishness at its very cause. So as to avoid these various problems, the suffering that selfishness causes both within each of us individually as well as socially, on up to the problems it causes for the entire world. When we speak of the origin of selfishness, we can begin by mentioning avijja, not knowing, or ignorance. Ignorance begins with birth. We're born lacking knowledge, and then it increases and grows as life continues, causing more and more problems. So we can begin this understanding of the causes of selfishness by examining ignorance. We are born ignorant from our mother's wombs. We lack knowledge. And then as we meet up with different things, they trick us, deceive us, and confuse us, so that ignorance grows and grows. This is something we need to examine closely. The first thing to talk about when discussing the origin of selfishness is not knowing, or ignorance. If we look back to birth, we'll see that when we are born, we don't know anything. We lack knowledge, and this is the meaning of ignorance, not having knowledge. And then after birth, as we make contact with all kinds of different things, then we react to them based on our various impulses and sensitivities and feelings. And this leads to our misunderstanding things or understanding them incorrectly. We don't see things as they really are. For example, when something lovely or attractive comes by, this leads to, because of our various feelings towards that thing, we fall in love with it, we like it, we react in that sort of way. And then for things which are ugly or unattractive, we follow our feelings and impulses and react towards them with anger or hatred, which is just another kind of misunderstanding. Or there are things which we react to with fear. Because we lack knowledge in the first place, our way of reacting, of interacting with things, is based in ignorance, which gives rise to further misunderstandings, and ignorance grows and grows to the point that our way of living is very foolish, to the point that we see everything as I and mine, that we understand that there is a self, and then even further act selfishly in regards to this self. This is how ignorance is the direct cause of selfishness in this way. In understanding how selfishness happens, we start by examining what we call contact, or patsa or contact. This is something that is taking place all the time in our lives. Our life is full of contacts, one after another. There are contact will occur in association with the eyes, with the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. There are these 6 types of contact, or patsa. And on this contact is the starting point for the development of selfishness. When we say contact, what we mean is that the eye, for example, the eye, the visual organ, comes into contact with a form, some sight, some visual object. When eye and form come into contact, then there arises eye consciousness. When the 3 come together, when these 3 meet, that is called contact. The same thing happens with the other senses, the ear and sounds and ear consciousness, the nose and smells and nose consciousness, the body, or the tongue, the body, and the mind. In these 6 different ways, there are these different kinds of contact. Although they happen with the different senses, it's essentially the same thing, of 3 factors working together: the eye, the form, and eye consciousness, and so forth, up to the mind, a mental object, and mind consciousness. The 3 factors meeting and working together is what we call patsa, or contact. In life, contacts, these various kinds of contact, are happening over and over, one after the other. Eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, or mind contact, one after the other, an endless series of contacts. This is the starting point for the growth of selfishness. We study Dhamma by studying contact in these 6 ways. Please understand that the only way to study Dhamma is to study these contacts as they really happen in life. Your study of this cannot be successful merely by listening to a talk or lecture about them. You can't really learn about patsa from books or from thinking about it. This is not what it means to actually study contact or to study Dhamma. The way to truly study this matter of contact or phassa is to study it as it actually occurs in life, as you actually experience it. The way to do this is to approach it scientifically, to take a very scientific attitude, and instead of working with mere abstract ideas, work with and study and experiment with the real thing. But this is a special kind of science where we don't focus on external things, but this is a science of the mind and body, our own minds and bodies, and we study contact there. This study won't be successful if it's merely an intellectual endeavor. But if we study the real thing as we experience it within our own minds, then we can actually see, we can clearly see the reality of this thing, phassa. We see it for itself. And this leads to an understanding of Dhamma through the direct experience of it. So please study these 6 kinds of phassa, of contact, within our own experience. Let's look at the first stage of this matter. The newborn infant has its first experience of contact, say through the eyes. And in the infant there is no understanding of whatever it is that makes contact. So there is the experience, and some feeling arises towards that contact. And this is a feeling that arises out of not knowing, out of ignorance. And so the reaction towards the contact is foolish. It's a misunderstanding and leads to some kind of misdeed. There's incorrect action coming out of it. And this happens repeatedly because of the lack of knowledge. There are these feelings and reactions towards eye consciousness, or towards eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, and so forth. And this misunderstanding grows and grows, becomes more and more foolish. This is what we call foolish or ignorant contact. It's contact that occurs in a context of ignorance, of a lack of knowledge. And this is the basis for ignorance and misunderstanding to grow and develop. And we say that this is the starting point of selfishness, because when there is ignorant contact, it continues and develops into the view that I am, that there is a self. And once that view arises, then there will develop selfishness. So this is the starting point of selfishness, right here at this ignorant contact, which is something that we all experienced from the beginning of our lives because of the lack of ignorance, and this basic, or because of the lack of knowledge. And from that fundamental ignorance has developed greater foolishness, which leads into more and more dangerous stupidity up to what we call selfishness. Ignorance at contact is the first stage of ignorance. The second stage of ignorance is that there arises vedana, or feeling. There's some kind of mental feeling towards that contact, towards that sense experience. And this is the second stage of ignorance. Because if the contact is ignorant, if it's foolish contact, then the feeling will also be foolish. And that's the second stage of ignorance. And then when there is foolish feeling, ignorance goes on to a third stage, and there arises desire based on that foolish feeling. And this kind of desire is, of course, ignorant also. It's not wise. And when there is this foolish desire, there will grow the foolish belief that there is a self, that desires. There will be an attachment to some I that desires. And then from this belief in a self, foolishness or ignorance becomes complete with the arising of selfishness. So there are these different stages of ignorance, beginning with contact, then foolish feeling, then foolish desire or craving, then attachment, and finally selfishness. Ignorance grows in this way, and the end result is selfishness. It will be impossible for you to understand Buddhism in its truest sense unless you study this matter of patsa and these stages of ignorance. If you can't understand this, if you're not willing to study it and look at it, then it will be absolutely hopeless for you to ever understand the heart of Buddhism. When there is ignorant contact, then there arises ignorant feeling. When there is this ignorant feeling, instead of just seeing the contact as something natural and ordinary, as just that, just a natural thing, instead of reacting and seeing it in this way, there arises ignorant feeling. Sometimes there is pleasure over the thing, or sometimes displeasure, or sometimes a uncertain feeling that is neither pleased nor displeased. All three of these are merely ignorant feeling based in not knowing. This happens when there is not the awareness that it's just a natural, ordinary phenomena. And so when this ignorant feeling arises, then these feelings will happen in different ways depending on the type of object. Different causes will condition pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant feeling. And then these ignorant feelings will condition various kinds of desire. The ignorance grows into the desire to get whatever it is pleases, or to destroy, to get rid of that which displeases. Or if it's uncertain feeling, that will lead to confusion, doubt, fear, worry, or something like that. So the different kinds of ignorant feeling arise and then condition ignorant desire. And then from these foolish desires, there arises the sense of the self that desires, the self that wants to get or destroy, or the feeling that this is my desire, or my wanting, my craving. So attachment arises because of the different kinds of ignorant desire. And then from that attachment, the sense of I and mine, their ignorance blossoms into selfishness. This is the heart of Buddhism. This, how ignorant contact develops through ignorant feeling on up to selfishness. This is the essential matter of Buddhism. The only way to truly understand Dhamma is to study this matter. You can only study it within your own bodies and minds. It can't be studied in books. So this is what it means to study Buddhism. If you don't bother to study this, then you'll never get anywhere near to understanding what Buddhism is about. So let's review this. There is first ignorant contact. Ignorant contact conditions ignorant feeling. Ignorant feeling conditions ignorant desire. Ignorant desire conditions the feeling or the sense that there is a self, an I, who desires. This leads to the thought, my desire. And this conditions selfishness. All of this, these different successive levels and developments of ignorance, is all happening internally within the mind. Please listen very carefully. This is all internal. All this ignorance is taking place inside. It's internal. There are also external conditions and causes for selfishness. The world is full of all kinds of things which incite selfishness, all kinds of strange and terrifying and exciting sight, forms, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and thoughts. The world is full of all these things which can incite selfishness. And then nowadays it's become even worse because there are so many people on the planet, in each country, in each city, that there's never enough to go around. There aren't enough things to go around, and so there's a lot of selfishness involved in struggling, in competing to get enough, to get what we need. So when we take this internal ignorance, which is the internal condition for selfishness, and then we take the external conditions of all these things which incite and encourage and fuel selfishness, along with the scarcity of what we need. When we have both the internal and external conditions, then selfishness is full and complete. What we've been talking about so far is the origin, the cause of selfishness. And now what we would like to look at is the basis, or the bases, the foundations of selfishness. Everything that exists must have a foundation, some kind of basis. And so we will now look at those things which are the basis, the foundation, the things on which selfishness is established or built. Selfishness arises out of this sense of there being a self, of there being something which is I. And this sense of self is further established on other things. And this is what we would like to look at. There are things which we take to be the self, and out of that grows selfishness. These things which are considered to be the self, we call the five kanta. The five kanta, that's the Pali word. In Sanskrit, the word is skanda, and in English we will call them aggregates. These are the five aggregates, the five kanta, which are taken to be the self. This is where the self idea is established. We'll call them aggregates for now, but exactly what we mean by that will become clearer as we discuss them. So please take a special interest in this. If you understand these five things which are the basis for selfishness, then you will have a powerful tool which will enable you to overcome this problem and the pain of selfishness. So please listen carefully about the five kanta. These five kanta, or aggregates, we can see these as being the ingredients of life. A life is made up of five parts, and these we call the kanta. Other systems of study may talk about it in another way, but in Dhamma, this is how we talk about life. We can see that life is basically made up of five parts, or components. The first part is the body, the physical component of life. This is rupa kanta. And then the rest is the mental components, the ingredients of life which make up the mind and heart, all the non-physical aspects, the mental, spiritual aspects of life. And there are four of these mental components. We put all these together and we get five parts, the five kanta, the five aggregates. Every time that there arises the sense of self, of I am, it is based upon one of these ingredients, one of these kanta. And it changes. Sometimes it is the sense of self is based on this kanta, sometimes on another kanta. But we haven't analyzed things carefully. We haven't looked at things clearly with understanding. Instead, we just follow our ignorant feelings, the awareness that has been conditioned out of ignorance, out of misunderstanding, and we go on this basis. We have this ignorant sense of a self, and we cling to this attachment to self. And we don't look more closely to see that every time there arises a sense of self, it's established on one of these aggregates. And so we lump it all together and develop a very firm and powerful belief in a self, in I. This is all conditioned by ignorance. And so it would do us well to look more closely and see that this idea of self is actually only conditioned and established upon these 5 kanta. We'll begin with the first aggregate, rupa kanta, or the form aggregate, the body aggregate. Rupa kanta is the body, it's the physical aspect of life. The body, rupa kanta, is unable to feel things by itself. There is no awareness in the body itself. But the body is, of course, necessary as the basis for the mind. The mind is established upon the body. And so it is the mind that is able to know things, which is able to sense things, feel things, and experience things. This is done by the mind. But that cannot happen without the body. So rupa kanta, the form aggregate, serves as this foundation for the mind. When we talk about this form aggregate, we include the nervous system. All the nerves, including the brain, are part of this physical part of life, the material, rupa kanta, which serves as the basis for awareness and feeling. When there's something very strange about this, which will, or it will sound very strange to you probably, that if we examine it, we'll see that when the body, when rupa kanta performs its function, when it does its job, then it exists. But whenever rupa kanta is not performing this function, then it does not exist. That may sound strange to you who have a concept of the body always existing. But when we talk in the language of Dhamma, we're concerned with what is actually experienced in the mind. And in Dhamma language, we say that rupa kanta only exists when it performs the basis, when it becomes the basis of some mental awareness. For example, when the visual nervous part of the nervous system, the eyes and everything, sees a form, or the ears make contact with the sound. When the body performs this function that allows for the arising of consciousness and the other mental factors, then we say that rupa kanta is performing its function. When it doesn't perform its function, there are merely the elements, which we can talk about, the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and wind. These 4 elements are there. But we only say that rupa kanta exists when it performs the function, which allows the mind to be aware. This is the first of the 5 aggregates. Even though this form aggregate, rupa kanta, has no awareness, it's completely unable to know anything or be aware of anything, even so, we go and attach to it as self. It itself doesn't know anything, but we go and attach to it as self. For example, if a finger is cut, we don't look at it and say, oh, a sharp metal object has sliced into some flesh. Instead, we go, I'm cut, I hurt. We don't see it as it really is, but we attach to this form aggregate as I. Or sometimes the hand hurts or a foot aches. And instead of seeing it merely as pain in the foot or pain in the hand, we attach to it, we cling to it as I, and there arises the thought I heard. So even though that in these physical components, these material aspects of life, there is no awareness in itself, they still can serve as the basis of our attachment because of ignorance. There arises these very foolish, ignorant thoughts that I am cut, I hurt, I'm going to die, and so forth, when it's only something happening to the body. And it doesn't happen just with the internal physical things of our own body. It even can happen with external physical objects, lifeless objects, such as we mentioned yesterday when a child bumps into a chair. There arises an ignorant feeling towards the chair, and the child projects upon the chair the thought that that is a self, and then with anger attempts to destroy and kill the self which has been projected on that chair. We can do this with all kinds of physical objects. These things are lifeless. They're not selves, but still because of the ignorant workings of the mind, we try to destroy or possess these things that we take to be selves, even those outside the body. And so in this way, even lifeless material, insensitive things can be the basis of pleasure, displeasure, and suffering. So the first aggregate is the form aggregate, rupa kanda. It has the nature of being hard, insensitive, and material. Then there are the nama kanda, the immaterial, the mental aggregates. And there are 4 of these. The mental aggregates perform the various functions of knowing, of being aware, of being sensitive, of thinking, of perceiving, and so forth. These are all mental functions. But these cannot occur without the physical rupa kanda. So the various nama kanda are dependent upon, they must be established upon rupa kanda. But even though they are dependent on the body in this way, they are nonetheless very, very important, because this is where all the kinds of mental operations are taking place in what we can call namakanda, or the mental aggregates, or more simply, mind. The mind performs 4 basic functions. We can discuss it in 4 basic ways, and these are the 4 mental khandas. Sometimes the mind performs the function of feeling, and we call this feeling aggregate. Sometimes the mind performs the function of perceiving or discriminating, and this we call sanya kanda, or perception aggregate. Other times the mind performs the function of thinking, of having emotions and so forth, opinions and all that. This is sankhara kanda, or the formations aggregate. And then sometimes the mind performs the function of knowing, the basic sense experience. And this is the basic sense consciousness is called vijnana kanda, consciousness aggregate. The mind has these 4 functions, and when it is performing one of these functions, then that aggregate arises to perform its duty. The first of these is the feeling kanda. When there is some kind of contact, then there arises a feeling towards it. This is a mental feeling of sometimes being pleased, other times displeased, and sometimes uncertain, neither pleased nor displeased. When this function of feeling takes place, this is then the basis for attachment. When there is some kind of ignorant feeling, when there is a foolish feeling of pleasure, displeasure, or uncertain feeling, Then there arises the attachment, I feel. I feel. The self is identified with feeling. I feel, and this is my feeling. So ignorant feeling becomes the basis of attachment in this way. And so when feeling is attached to, when feeling is taken to be the self, then life becomes this attachment to feeling. When feeling arises, if it is just seen as a natural occurrence, something that is conditioned under the law of cause and effect, as just a natural thing that is just that, then it does not need to become the basis of attachment. But in general, because it is not seen in this way, the feeling is taken to be I, mine, and myself. The next aggregate, or the third kanta, is sanya kanta. Sanya is often translated perception. It's when the mind performs the function of perceiving something. But this is not the full meaning of the word sanya. Sanya kanda is broader than merely perceptions. Once the mind perceives something, then it also recognizes. It recognizes it as this or that. And then on top of that recognition, it is regarded. Not only is it recognized to be this, but then it is regarded to be this and then classified according to that recognition and regarding. So sanya kanda is more than just perception. It includes perception, recognition, to regard it as that according to how it is recognized, to actually take it to be that, and to classify or categorize it accordingly. In this way, sanya kanda very easily becomes the basis for attachment. We perceive, recognize, and classify things to be good and bad. This is pleasant, that's unpleasant. This is good, that's bad. This is nice, that's ugly. This is beautiful, and so forth. This is male, this is female. This is getting, this is a loss, this is a gift, this is a sacrifice, and so forth. All these different kinds of perceptions and discriminations are taken to be I in mind. I perceive, I recognize. And for each of us, there is a steady increase in suffering